Remember when Anomaly Inc. said this?
Appreciating what we used to hate is certainly something that human beings tend to do when something new comes out and they tend to hate it more. A personal example that I will use is Terminator 3. I was an 8-year-old at the time of its release, and Terminator 2 being my favorite movie of all time back then, I was pumped out of my mind to see T3. And then I did, and well, honestly, I really hated it. Now, as I became more mature, it eventually grew on me more and more, but the biggest downer for me about that film was the ending, because it felt like it undercut the beautiful ending of Terminator 2, and not to mention the plot was very derivative of that movie. When Terminator Salvation came out, which I actually really like by the way, Terminator 3 improved even more in my eyes because I was like, wow, okay, at least that bleak ending actually led somewhere, and it didn't just end depressingly. Then Terminator Genisys and Terminator Dark Fate, especially Dark Fate, came out and were abominations, and then I really warmed up to Terminator 3. And when I watched it again, I realized that unlike all of Terminator Dark Fate and most of Terminator Genisys, there was some actual great character work in there. I'd go as far as to say excellent character work in Terminator 3. There is more character in John Connor's opening monologue in Terminator 3 than Terminator Genisys and Dark Fate combined. Also, Terminator 3 was much more mature than Terminator Genisys in many intelligent ways, while Terminator Dark Fate had probably the most mature rating in terms of violence and gore, but instead of being intelligent with it, it just ejaculated nonsense all over the screen. Terminator Dark Fate and Terminator Genisys being terrible movies did make me go back and appreciate Terminator 3, yes. Was it a good movie that I just thought was bad? Or was it a bad movie that I just hated for the wrong reasons? I can't definitively tell you whether or not Terminator 3 is a good or bad movie. I'd have to spend more time with it.
Well, since I was tired of waiting for his opinion on Terminator 3, I decided to express my own. Part of the reason I make videos is because I wish other people would make it, but since they don't, I just make it myself. Anyways, with that being said, when it comes to film resurgence, Terminator 3 and Terminator Salvation are certainly more relevant in recent memory. Those two are the first I'd think about after the Star Wars prequels. Perhaps Salvation will be another video, but I wanted to talk about the end of the original Terminator trilogy. A disappointment to many at the time, Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines was criticized for many things, but through the span of time, some re-evaluation, and the true example of what an actually bad Terminator movie looked like, I wanted to discuss the resurgence of Terminator 3 and discuss why I think it's great. Now, Terminator 3 is by all that matters fan fiction. James Cameron was not involved with this movie, or at least the stage this movie would take when it became Rise of the Machines and not Future War. So the first thing to discuss is James Cameron's vision. Since the original creator's vision is the correct one, is this a disrespectful sequel to a story that had already reached its natural conclusion? I think the answer is more complicated than what we think. According to James Cameron, in his vision, the story was concluded in Terminator 2 Judgment Day, but the film itself left it ambiguous whether or not the future was actually changed, meaning that sequels were inevitable, with different stories giving their own version of what happened after Terminator 2. In the main series, discluding comics and stuff, we've got Rise of the Machines and Salvation, and then we've got the Sarah Connor Chronicles, and then we've got Dark Fate. The point I'm making is that the film left it open-ended, and besides, James Cameron himself invalidated his word when Dark Fate came out, a movie that he was involved in. We all know that Dark Fate is a shit stain, but the thing that bothers me about it is whether or not it's actually the canonical sequel to Terminator 2, given James Cameron was more involved at least to some extent. It is said Tim Miller and James Cameron had creative differences, so the answer is probably no, but this is the film with the tagline that this is James Cameron's version of what happened after T2. If you ask me, I'd rather have Rise of the Machines be the canonical sequel. But I'm not going to contradict myself when I was talking about authenticity. Rise of the Machines is a way better movie than Dark Fate. So what I'm going to talk about is, despite its creatively fan fiction status, T3 is actually a great movie in its own right. So let's begin. Terminator 3 has a lot of criticisms thrown at it over the years. The movie's biggest sin in the eyes of many is that it's a rehash of Terminator 2. And I agree, it is the biggest sin, but I want to point out there's a distinction I make towards something like The Force Awakens and Terminator 3. The Force Awakens is a rip-off, But why is that a problem in the instance of that movie? Because it invalidated the happy ending of Return of the Jedi. It brought back the Empire and started the Empire versus Rebels conflict all over again. As well as this, it and its sequels killed off the original cast to put crappier ones on a pedestal and act like they're the true heroes. This is exactly what Dark Fate did. It invalidated the original heroes and the conflict, and then put crappier characters on a pedestal. Danny Ramos is exactly the same as John Connor, just with diversity-filled nonsense sprinkled all over it. T3 doesn't do that. T3 is a sequel to T2 Judgement Day that continues the story, characters, and conflict of the first two movies. First thing it does is establish John Connor's doings since Terminator 2, and the opening narration nailed the setup for his arc in this movie. John Connor discusses his role as the Chosen One, how the storm was coming, and that he would lead the human race to ultimate victory against Skynet. The score, despite not being composed by Brad Fiedel, certainly assists the movie. I idolize this brief moment we see John Connor in an older age, celebrating the victory against the machines. Speaking of, I love the actor they chose for John Connor. Given Edward Furlong was out of shape and had drug problems, his replacement was the next best thing. Looks aside, I feel like we hadn't skipped actors at all. Nick Stahl is great as John Connor and the rendition he played in this movie. That being a junkie terrified of the future. A man who never truly rested and always feared what was to come for the future. Ready to fight if the bombs ever did start dropping. Like, I want to point out that although John Connor is practically a homeless junkie living off the grid, his preparation has never been stronger. You guys remember how Tim Miller imagined an alive John Connor who would be an accountant who achieved nothing and missed his mark on history? Yeah, well, on paper, John Connor being a homeless junkie seems worse, but given his character is established to be always on the move, ready to face Skynet should the worst come to pass, it made for a great bridge in between Judgment Day and Rise of the Machines. Given Sarah Connor has died in between movies, her presence is missed immensely, but I think it assisted the movie, because her arc was completed in the first two movies. And also, Sarah's death makes John's low standing in life punch that much more. John Connor is heartbroken, terrified, and is an absolute wreck. Even though he's prepared for anything, he isn't fully sold on his role as humanity's great savior. So with that being said, given this is Terminator 3, we know what's going to happen. Terminators are going to show up. Going back to the rehash criticism, did Terminator 3 invalidate Terminator 2? As I said before, James Cameron in his own personal vision said the story was over, but Terminator 2 left it kind of close-ended whether or not the future was actually affected. The movie left a blank slate is what I'm saying. And yes, I know that the extended cut gave us a definitive ending, but here's the thing, the extended cut was released in 2015. 12 years after Terminator 3. So the blank slate left by Terminator 2 still existed, so sequels were going to happen. I personally got behind Terminator 3 because the main problem I have with Terminator 2 is that it cut the story way too short. Terminator at least deserved to cap off as a trilogy. The ending to Terminator 2 led to infinite possibilities and the story could go any way. There are 4 on-screen versions of what happened after Terminator 2. This movie and its sequel Salvation, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, Dark Fate, and the extended cut ending of Terminator 2. I'm yet to see the Sarah Connor Chronicles, maybe that'll be a review on its own. So that's my case for Terminator 3's sequel status, and whether or not it undid Terminator 2. I would like to say that Terminator 2 did have consequences. John Connor quite clearly says no bombs fell the day they were supposed to, that being 1997. This movie is set in the year 2004. A minor issue with the film is continuity, admittingly. John Connor was 10 in Terminator 2, but Terminator 3 mistakenly says that John was 13. I think the filmmakers got the dates wrong to some extent, but the ages don't matter that much as they are easily retconnable, and the story would still work. It's important to note that Edward Furlong was 13 when Terminator 2 was released, so maybe that's where the mistake stems from. Going by the first two films, Connor would be canonically 19 in Terminator 3, but he seems to be a bit older. Regardless, given Connor is an adult, the story is still easily retconnable. So anyways, the film does what any sequel should. Continue the story. Given you sat down to watch a movie called Terminator 3, you know there's going to be Terminators. The story isn't just going to be about John Connor snorting coke and smoking dope. Anyways, we get to the typical arrival scene. First, we are shown the trademark Terminator in the movie. The TX, played by Kristanna Loken. Now, we know that no one was going to top Robert Patrick or even Arnold, but that didn't stop them from trying. To be honest, I feel the TX is a solid antagonist. Loken was trained to act visually, given the limited dialogue she has. The TX is a cold and emotionless machine. They were considering having Vin Diesel be what would eventually become the TX. While I'm open to Vin Diesel being a Terminator in another movie, I think Kristanna Loken was more fresh. The TX is more robotic than a T-1000, sort of like Arnold, but has the skill set and equipment of the T-1000, so it's a perfect blend of the two antagonists. The TX is a machine Skynet would send back on assassination missions. So for the pervs watching, the butt-naked TX lands in a clothing store, but decides to kill a woman instead for her clothes. Apparently in the novelization of T3, the TX took everything from the poor woman, including her underwear. Yeah, the TX is supposed to be the seductive kind of Terminator. But hey, the T-1000 had some odd quirks about him as well. I suspect the TX was originally designed by Skynet to have some feminine personality and a little bit of independence, but not to the extent the T-1000 have. Maybe it's elaborated on in a book, I don't know. I haven't actually heard much complaints about the TX or the actress that plays her. So let's move on to the next aspect of the film. The humor. The second biggest problem I've heard is that the jokes are unneeded and out of place, but I don't think it ruins the movie. The comedy style is akin to that of Ghostbusters, that being that it's subtle and witty, but I never felt like it happens at inappropriate times. Like, we'll get into the T-850's arrival. This was most definitely the last movie they could have used Arnold in without coming up with an explanation for the aging actor. I appreciate the little touch where the sand in his landing spot turned to glass. It's a minor detail, but I think it's great attention to detail. So Arnold walks into a strip club for women, and again, I want to press that this is not an inappropriate time for jokes. Nothing serious is happening around this time, so it can get away with it. Plus, something I want to bring up is that the jokes are fucking hilarious. The jokes being unneeded is a separate debate, but all the jokes in the movie have great pacing and delivery. The comedic energy is never overdone. What you can say about Terminator 3 compared to Genesis and Dark Fate is that the jokes in T3 are actually well written and well executed. So Arnold approaches a male stripper and essentially tells him to take off his clothes, and proceeds to grip his hand when he doesn't do so. And perhaps some foreshadowing for the most iconic line in this movie.
Talk to the hand.
So anyways, Arnold walks out of the strip club with the dude's clothes, where, let's be honest, the dude was going to take off his clothes anyways. He puts on Elton John glasses, hilarious, but of course he takes it off and crushes them with his foot. A clever reference to the original movie. Anyways, with that being said, we should discuss the lead female character in this movie, Catherine Brewster. Given Linda Hamilton declined the cameo in T3, feeling her character's arc was over, they of course needed a new female character in Terminator 3. That being a spouse for John Connor. Like, John Connor's future wife was of course a natural way to progress the story, and like a sequel should, it elaborates on the future war. At the start of the movie, the TX is assigned to terminate John Connor's lieutenants in the future instead of a single target. This shows that Skynet's strategy is constantly evolving, as it is coming up with new ideas to defeat John Connor. And if terminating John Connor failed twice, then why not get rid of his clueless lieutenants in the past? So it may be easier to get to John Connor without his resistance. Like, it's actually reactive to the previous two movies. Skynet is learning to come up with a better strategy when it sends Terminators across time. So point is, John Connor and Kate Brewster's first on-screen interaction happens when John breaks into the vet, and Kate catches him stealing medicines for dogs. I love John and Kate's banter here, and Kate outwits John by throwing the pills at him and using the time to take his gun and fire the pellets at him because it turns out it's a paintball gun, and locks him in an animal cage. This scene demonstrates how the nomad lifestyle has affected John Connor. In this movie, it's demonstrated that John and Kate know each other back from Terminator 2. I like how they used Kate Brewster's character to further establish John Connor's self-imposed exile from the world. Also, Kate is infinitely more charismatic, relatable, and likable than Danny Ramos ever was. I think Kate Brewster herself is underrated, especially since she is merely a supporting character in Salvation. Kate Brewster is played by Claire Danes, who I recognize from that Romeo and Juliet movie from the 90s. The one with Leonardo DiCaprio in it. I think the casting for Kate Brewster was spot on. Claire Danes, at least to me, is realistically attractive and actually looks like someone who would be John Connor's spouse. That being said, Kate Brewster's character also has some solid writing. Just like every other character involved in the series, Kate loses practically everyone she cares about throughout the course of the story. Speaking of, her father, Robert Brewster, is the catalyst for Skynet in this movie. It's explained that even though Cyberdyne Systems was destroyed, the research they provided allowed Skynet to still exist. That is actually a pretty clever explanation for the delay. The microchip was far ahead of its time. I do feel there is a missed opportunity when it comes to the arm that the T2 Arnold left behind at the end of the movie. Like, obviously that was just an error James Cameron made to not have that arm destroyed, but imagine if that arm was actually used in T3. It could sort of be like a Chekhov's gun for a film error, and they'd be covering their bases. Also, the titular rise of the machines in this movie is well handled, especially for its time. The film was actually pretty unique with the idea of Skynet taking control of the internet and cyberspace. Keep in mind, in 2003, the internet was still relatively new, and it actually made for a cool concept that the AI network no longer had a physical form, but rather exists everywhere in cyberspace and stuff like that. It's not very impressive today, but it was certainly very creative back in the day, and it does feel like a product of its time in this movie. Anyways, the first contact with the machines in this movie occurs when the TX arrives at the vet. She wounds one of Kate's co-workers and kills her. I personally found this to be a creepy cue from the antagonist. She does the same when she encountered John Connor's blood, given by the paintball gun, and she orgasms. I will concede and say that specifically was poorly timed. Kate Brewster is subdued by the TX, and at her mercy, she asks where John Connor is given he is nearby from the blood. And then, of course, Arnold shows up and rams the TX into the wall with his car. So with that being said, Arnold gives his robotic persona, second to that of Terminator 2. Age hasn't affected him one bit. He's still got the same charisma. Given Kate's importance, Arnold locks Kate in a van and then goes out for John Connor. And John, seeing another T-800, startles him. This time around, the T-800 is less protective of John Connor, and I like how they show this reprogrammed T-800 doesn't have the same priority as the one from T2. In the first movie, he was the antagonist. In the second movie, he was the good guy and a father figure to John Connor. In this movie, he is middle of the road. His role is practically an unempathetic protector, so it's a little bit middle of the road. At least that's how I felt about his character by watching the movie. Now, the film wasn't going to trick you into thinking Arnold was the bad guy again. It was quite clear that Arnold would be the good guy again, so there's no twists surrounding the Protector. But do you know what it does have? The rise of Skynet. But we'll get to that. The following action scene has been criticized for being a retread of the scene in Terminator 2. And I'm not going to argue that there are clear similarities, but that doesn't mean I think that the action scene is bad. First, when I heard about how a lot of the stunts were done, that made me appreciate it greatly. Second, I think it's a larger scale version of what we saw in Terminator 2. Whereas in T2 it was mostly John Connor, Arnold and the T-1000, this action sequence involves a busy road. John Connor, while driving, is dodging traffic and trying to outrun the TX. At the same time, the action sequence has many things going on at once, which I'm sure took a lot of planning and storyboarding for the sequence. Although it's akin to the scene in Terminator 2, I don't see it as lazy. Also, the way Arnold makes it to John and Kate is batshit insane. I can only imagine what the stunt work was like. Like when Arnold lands on the fire truck, he says, "I'll drive," and turns the truck around with the firefighters jumping out. So of course they escape the TX. With that, we get our exposition explaining why the Terminators were able to come back. Arnold explains to John that Judgment Day is inevitable. Yeah, that's the plot twist. When I started thinking about the story, that twist actually makes a lot of sense. As I said, it's shown that the military recovered the research from Cyberdyne Systems, and while it delayed Judgment Day, it did not stop it. Thinking about how the story unfolded in the first two movies, I kind of find it unlikely that the world wouldn't succumb to machines one day. Even if Skynet didn't rise, another artificial intelligence could have done so. If Skynet could rise in the Terminator universe, so could a different one under the right circumstances. Going back to John Connor's opening monologue, he feared the return of the machines, paranoid of the future. And with hindsight, I don't think the story truly was over realistically. Terminator 3 just as well could have been a what-if kind of movie based on the future war. I'm just saying. So out in the middle of the desert, they park at a convenience store, Arnold grabs a bunch of food and whatnot, plus some shades, before telling the clerk,
"Talk to the hand."
To be honest, I don't actually know what that's supposed to mean. The male stripper said the same thing earlier, so it was likely a callback, but as I said before, the joke doesn't happen at the most inappropriate of times. This is a part of the movie where it calms down after the big action sequence. Now, the scared Kate Brewster talks about how her fiancé will be looking for her, as well as another interaction between John and Kate. It's revealed that John and Kate kissed at some club or something the day before the Terminators came after him. Now, given what happens later, this is the setup for John and Kate's relationship in the movie. And then, of course, we cut to the character who holds the record for being the guy I feel the most bad for in the entire series. As Scott Peterson, Kate's fiancé, is brutally murdered by the TX, who takes his form and follows two agents who come to the apartment. The yelling from Scott is truly haunting and hard-hitting for me. So the scene after that, the trio go to a cemetery, where it's revealed that Sarah Connor died of leukemia in 1997. Frankly, I think the movie would have been slightly better if Linda Hamilton didn't decline that cameo she was offered, but I think the workaround was the best they could have done. And of course, it turns out that the coffin doesn't have Sarah's body, but instead, guns and ammo. That is actually kind of fitting. Kate Brewster grabs a gun and threatens to shoot Arnold, and she proceeds to shoot Arnold and he just spits out the bullet. I like this part because it presents how much John Connor is used to this sort of stuff by now. And of course, Kate's shock tells you all you need to know. Then in a scene I think is supposed to reference the gas smoke sequence from Terminator 2, the FBI smoke the building, and Kate runs out of the building, as John Connor hides in the coffin and the T-800 escorts him out, with him inside the coffin. On Kate's end, we get the well-implemented cameo of Dr. Silberman, played by the same guy as the previous two movies. Let me say firsthand that his cameo was not wasted. I like how they closed off his role in the trilogy. He's still in disbelief that what he saw in T2, aka the T-1000 morph into a war, was real. Personally, I would have had him wonder whether or not Terminators actually exist at this point, but oh well. I think it is character consistent. The dude was sort of a hurdle in Terminator 2, and I guess he wouldn't want to believe Sarah Connor after she tried to pump him full of juice in T2. So with that being said, Kate runs away along with Dr. Silberman, in separate directions of course, and Arnold scares away the FBI. And in another reveal of the movie, he explains to John Connor that Catherine Brewster is his wife. Damn, I've already spoken about this, but this is the part in the movie where it's specifically revealed. Anyhow, the TX disguised as Scott approaches Kate. And I do remember someone criticizing how the TX changed back into its true form way too early, but I mean, I don't think it matters that much because even if Kate tried to run, the TX would catch up to her. Thankfully, Arnold shows up to save the day and blasts the TX away. So again, we've got another escape sequence. Before we get to the outskirts of somewhere, we take a break to reflect on what's just happened. Kate mourns Scott, and as well as that, Arnold talks about Kate's role as John's future wife. Of course, John can't fully come to the idea that he will be married to Kate, and this is where the whole setup for the third act starts. Arnold insists that John and Kate will go outside the blast zones in time, but when they learn that Kate's father Robert is the catalyst for Skynet, John says that they must go to stop Skynet. But Arnold refuses, saying that there is insufficient time. John decides to pull out a gun and tells Arnold that if he wants there to be a John Connor to fight Skynet, then he must take he and Kate to Robert Brewster. Arnold agrees and they hop onto an RV. It's around this time that the details of Arnold and the future war come out. Arnold explains to Kate and John that he was reprogrammed by the Resistance, and that he killed John Connor in 2032 before his wife Kate had him reprogrammed and sent him back to protect John and Kate, and hopefully all the other members of the Resistance, which they were too late for. The exposition I find to be intriguing because it highlights more about the future. John Connor was not invincible or untouchable. We also get a scene of Kate talking about his past relationship with John. You see, when Arnold revealed that Kate would be John's spouse and second in command, she wasn't ready to accept that, and said that John was a mess, expressing that she had no interest in it. I also like this part of the movie. Kate and John have no interest in each other in this movie, but it's their roots that lead to their eventual marriage. It's quite common that your spouse, girlfriend, or significant other could be someone you had absolutely no interest in when you met them, and you could go on a while before you started having feelings for them that gradually develops. Like, I understand why they had Kate and John know each other before the start of the movie, because given Kate's fiancé was just murdered, something like this would have eased her into what was essentially Scott's replacement, and that would be a tough pill to swallow because she was going to marry Scott, not John. That's just my take on the matter. But in short, it's something that I completely buy, although an issue arises in the next scene. Now, I'm not talking about Robert Brewster plugging in Skynet, as that was actually quite a good moment in the movie. We know what Skynet is, and the tension slowly rises as Skynet takes control of the machines. The problem is the interruption. They kind of skipped the scene of the trio breaking into the American military establishment. Like, don't get me wrong, Arnold could definitely break into Area 51, for example, if he wanted to, but there isn't a scene of him doing that. They sort of just have the trio in the building. I find this to be a minor issue because although it seems like they skipped the scene, it's not hard to buy that they would make it into the base. Anyways, Robert gets shot by the TX, and the trio are too late to save him. Skynet begins to take over, and as that's happening, the machines begin to slaughter everyone. The haywire going on makes the tension rise and rise as Skynet begins to control everything. I also gotta praise the designs for the machines. The T-18 is beautifully designed and looks exactly like an early Skynet model. It's important to note that although James Cameron was not involved, the designer Stan Winston was. So that's probably why the film looks like a Terminator film. If there is something authentic about Terminator 3, it isn't the story, but the designs and the look of the film, because the original designer was involved. Then we've got Robert giving John and Kate directions to a VIP bunker. John is led to believe that this is Skynet's system core. They make it through machines and this one-way tunnel that made for a creative way of having a cramped space as the TX approach the both of them. And there's the bathroom fight between Arnold and the TX. A subtle nod to the original movie I noticed was this. Anyways, we get a part of the movie that I believe characterizes the T-800 a little bit. He malfunctions and is conflicting between his original programming and his reprogrammed nature. So we see that the T-800 struggles not to terminate John Connor. He persists and shuts himself down. So John and Kate take her father's plane and go across the desert and reach the bunker. And with that, the final showdown happens. Arnold and the TX fight each other one more time, and John and Kate manage to make it down to the bunker, with the T-800 terminating the TX, sacrificing itself to save John and Kate. We then proceed to get John and Kate reach the bunker, and this is where the great ending comes into shape. John slowly realized that he was misled. This is no system core. The bunker is just reserved for government officials and has age-old computers. The sound is quiet. No music is playing. A baffled John starts to ask why Arnold let him down here if they couldn't stop Skynet. Kate tells him, realizing what Arnold meant, says,
"To live."
They get a radio comm from a government official, I presume, and when asked who is in charge, John says,
"I am."
This line I really like, because this one line concludes John Connor's arc in the original Terminator trilogy. His entire life, he's been against his destiny. Now he's embracing it when he realizes there's no other way. The music picks up. Kate holds John's hand and the narration begins again, enforcing the completion of his arc. John explains through narration that Skynet had no system core. It became a part of cyberspace, unable to be stopped from the nuclear holocaust. And 3 billion people died across the planet. Skynet took over and began its genocide against humanity. And John talks about how his destiny was never to stop Judgment Day, but to survive it. He accepts his fate and vows to never stop fighting, before the final line.
The battle has just begun.
And with that, the film closes and the credits roll. I quite liked this ending, and I think the hatred came from the idea that it undercut Terminator 2. But given how well written the explanations for why Terminator 3 exists in the first place are so spot on, I can't help but say that this sequel absolutely justified itself with damn good writing. The film creatively uses the rise of the internet to explain how Skynet returned and became a system that could not be shut down. It explains Judgment Day is inevitable without falling down the trap of having the time travel become a rabbit hole. I believe this film can stand on its own without Terminator Salvation. Terminator 3 is how I also see Spider-Man 3. Sequels that underwhelmed, but gained a status as underappreciated art. I think that had Terminator 3 been made today, it would have been received infinitely better. Like, I don't think it would have surpassed Terminator 1 or 2, but it would have been a sequel that garnered a lot more praise. Of course, the movie is a film of its time, going back to the rise of the internet. What I notice about every Terminator movie is that they are movies of their time. The very first is a very 80s movie with its symbolism and art style. Terminator 2 defined the 90s as being the most cool thing from the time period. Terminator 3 I've already explained. Terminator Salvation you could tell was made in 2009 because of its cast of actors who were absolutely most notable at that time. Terminator Genisys is among the collection of failed reboots, remakes and sequels that were being made at the time. And Dark Fate, well, let's just say that it has SJW nonsense. I doubt there's going to be another Terminator movie after Dark Fate, but if it is, they need to get creative with the next movie. My suggestion is maybe a crossover movie. Like maybe it could be something like Terminator vs. The Thing. That would be my dream crossover. Anyways, Terminator 3 is underappreciated. People stand around and praise Salvation a lot more than T3. And if they ever do bring T3 up, they'll just say something like, oh, well, at least Terminator 3's bleak ending led somewhere. And the story didn't just end there and then. And while I'll talk about Salvation in another video, I have to say, I absolutely understand the underwhelmed reception of T3. I really do. But this movie isn't one you should hate on. The resurgence of this film, I believe, is genuine. I do believe in a perfect world they could have done better, but for what it's worth, Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines, leans towards an 8.5 out of 10 for me. It will be forever overshadowed by the first two, but that doesn't make it a bad movie or a bad sequel. That is my take on T3. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories by mystery boxes?
Water was running, children were running, you were running out of time. Under the mountain, a golden fountain, were you praying at the Loris shrine?